Recent years have seen a new Civil War debate over who should be honored in Statuary Hall in the U.S. Capitol building. Gene's book is the first to ever review the history of the relationship between Statuary Hall and both civil wars, the one which was fought in the 19th century and an ongoing civil war in concept. Statuary Hall was created in the midst of the war in 1864 via legislation authored by Representative Justin Morrill of Vermont to fill space left by the House of Representatives when they moved into their glistening new chamber just up the hall. Morrill's legislation invited each state to honor two of their citizens by providing representative statues. The first statue depicting Nathaniel Greene of Rhode Island was placed in 1870, and by 1971, just over a century later, each state had sent at least one statue to represent them in this collection. Recently, as Confederate monuments have been taken down in many cities across the United States, and as federal legislation was passed requiring the renaming of Army bases and other significant sites to remove Confederate generals and their names, suggestions and demands for replacement in the National Statuary Hall collection have increased. Several changes have been made, and it's likely that we're going to see many more as we push ahead. Now, to guide us through this conversation, to lead us is a wonderful scholar. Gene Schmiel is a retired Department of State Foreign Service officer and a former assistant professor of history at St. Francis University in Pennsylvania. He has a PhD from The Ohio State University, which I know will make several folks on this call and watching our recording very glad to hear. From 2020 to 2023, Schmiel published 18 books in his series Civil War Personalities 50 at a Time, including Civil War trailblazers and troublemakers, Civil War rogues, rascals, and rapscallions, and Civil War women, underestimated and indispensable. These books include short bios of characters who made the Civil War era colorful and fascinating. Each bio was accompanied by period photographs or drawings, political cartoons, and sometimes maps by the great Hal Jefferson. In 2019, he published two books, Ohio Heroes of the Battle Franklin and Lincoln, Antietam, and a Northern Lost Cause, a speculative history of the Civil War. His first book on the Civil War, Citizen General Jacob Dolson Cox and the Civil War Era, was a History Book Club selection and was chosen as Biography of the Year in 2014 by the Civil War Books and Authors website. So, with this great background in American history, Civil War history, knowledge of government processes through your time in the Foreign Service, Gene, please talk to us about the Civil War and Statuary Hall.
Well, Mr. Holliday, thank you very much. I can be heard. I'm not muted or anything. We're all set? Okay, good. Thank you very much. Okay, well, I'm starting here with the opening page, the Civil War and Statuary Hall, who should be memorialized in the U.S. Capitol. And that's the name of the book. And I wrote this book 2019, 2020. And I have revised it 4 times because in the last 5 years, there have been significant changes in Statuary Hall, many of them reflecting the new viewpoint about the memory of the Civil War, who should be memorialized, and of course, who should not be memorialized. So let's take a look first back at the history of why the Civil War is so, and the Statuary Hall is so closely related. Just one point, you may remember that back on January 20th, the inauguration had to be moved indoors because of the cold weather. And here's a picture of the inauguration ceremony. And behind the podium here, we have statues of Abraham Lincoln and Ulysses Grant, obviously 2 of the major figures of the Civil War. And over here is a statue of Harry Truman. So Statuary Hall came into the public viewpoint more than usual recently because the inauguration was indoors. Statuary Hall, what we call it, was the House of Representatives until 1863. And this is a drawing of what the House of Representatives looked like until 1863. And you'll recognize it when we look at what Statuary Hall looks like today. And this is a painting by Samuel Morse. Samuel Morse obviously was one of the great inventors of all time, but he was also a very skilled painter. So I wanted people to look at this, a painting of the house in session in 1823. Anyway, in the 1850s, the government concluded that with the population growing larger and larger, that the buildings which represented the House over here on the right and the Senate over here on the left were too small, and that there needed to be larger buildings, and there also needed to complete the Capitol, which had not been completed. So in this second, you see, here's the old House where I'm pointing, here's the old Senate, here's the new House, and here's the new Senate, and here's the Statue of Freedom, which was placed on top of the Capitol in 1863, right in the middle of the Civil War. So beginning in 1851, construction began on the new House and the new Senate building and the completion of the dome of the Capitol. And the question then is, what were we going to do with the old House and the old Senate? And one of those decision makers, because the War Department was in charge of the construction, was Jefferson Davis. Jefferson Davis was Secretary of War in the from 1853 1856, and his office was in charge of deciding how the construction would go ahead, what might go into the chamber after the construction, and what's going to be the nature of the statue on top of the Capitol building. And this is a selection here of the about that particular issue. Original here over here on the left is the original design for the Statue of Freedom in 1855, and then it was changed. And the second image showed the person on top of the Capitol wearing what was called the Liberty Cap, the cap of the Marie of the French Revolution, the symbol of revolution, of throwing off slavery. And Jefferson Davis was not happy with that. He did not like that image, so he did not approve that. And so the new image, many changes, and this on the right is the final design of the Capitol, of the Statue of Freedom, which is atop the Capitol building. Now, one of the first ideas for dealing with the old House of Representative Chamber was to make it a museum, and it was a museum for a while, and this is the model, the clay model for the Statue of Freedom, which was on exhibit in the old House building for a while in the late 1850s. And this is pretty much what it looks like now. Early in the Civil War, Congressman Justin Morrill, who served in the House for 12 years and the Senate for over 25 years, he took the lead on legislation. Now, Justin Morrill is most famous for the land grant colleges legislation. I went to The Ohio State University, and so Congressman Morrill was very instrumental in helping to create Ohio State. But he said at the time, the old House of Representatives is empty and deserted, and as it now appears, as a conspicuous nuisance. And so in 1864, he introduced legislation to have Congress invite each state to contribute 2 statues of prominent citizens for permanent display in the room. And it was then to be renamed National Statuary Hall. And one of the interesting things about that, now Morrill created the legislation, but in the beginning, the Senate opposed because they thought it would cost too much. And in mid-1864, there was a conference committee, and the leadership in finally ensuring that the Statuary Hall would be created was led by Congressman Thaddeus Stevens. And Thaddeus Stevens, as we know, was the most radical anti-secession, most radical anti-slavery member of Congress. And the fact that he was the one who ensured that this would happen, there is a certain irony given what we're going to be talking about here. Okay, so at Morrill's initiative, each state would have total autonomy. Each state would choose by itself who it would honor. And this would, in some cases, would be used to glorify the lost cause of the Confederacy. And there's an FYI here. Justin Morrill himself was not one of those honored by Vermont. I think he should have been, but that's a decision for the state of Vermont. Anyway, the very first statue was of Nathaniel Greene of Rhode Island. And in the first years of the Statuary Hall, most of the honorees were men during and before the Revolutionary period. Now, Abraham Lincoln, his statue, that's the one that we saw behind President Trump when he was being inaugurated. This was in place in 1871, but again, an irony. Abraham Lincoln is not one of the honorees of Illinois. He's an honoree of the entire United States, but he is not an honoree of Illinois. But he was in place in 1871. And the most recent statue, again, because of changes, was late to 2024, Martha Hughes Cannon of Utah. And we'll talk about that. As you can see, if you can read it here, the first female state senator, she was a physician, and she was a suffragist from Utah. Okay. Now, one interesting thing about the people in Statuary Hall is some of these are people that are not well known. They were well known in their particular state, but they were not nationally known. And many of those in place really exemplify the American dream. They were self-made people, many of them not from privilege. And here are some examples. On the left here, we have Father Damien. Father Damien from Hawaii. He was a humble priest who was a missionary to the lepers in the leper colonies in Hawaii. And so he was honored by Hawaii. Here we have Norman Borlaug. Now, most people don't know Norman Borlaug from Iowa, but you should know him because this man saved more people from starvation than any in the history of the world, really. He was the father of the Green Revolution and deserved to be honored. So he's from Iowa. Here we have Will Rogers, a Cherokee, again, came from very humble origins. He's honored by Oklahoma. Here we have Sacagawea, or Sacagawea, as some people call her, honored by North Dakota, obviously from very humble origins, but a very important person, the guide for Lewis and Clark. Here we have Nebraska, William Jennings Bryan. And finally, over here, someone whom no one remembers, but you all should because we're looking at him right now, and that was Philo Farnsworth. Now, Philo Farnsworth of Utah was the father of television. Now, he's the one, he was replaced by Martha Cannon, whom we just looked at last year, but Philo Farnsworth. So many people have not heard of some of these, but they should. Okay, now about 40% of the 100 statues, again, 50 states, 100 statues. District of Columbia is not represented there because the legislation said only the states were to be represented. And from 1871 to 1901, during the 19th century, only Civil War representatives, there were 23 placed, and 7 of them were from the northern states from the Civil War. They were James Garfield over here from Ohio, who was a Civil War general as well a president, Phil Kearny of New Jersey, James Shields, who was one of the two men representative from Illinois. James Shields has a distinction. He was a senator from 3 different states. Here we have Frank Blair Jr. from Missouri. Frank Blair was an interesting fellow. He was a general in the Civil War. At the same time, he was a congressman. And so he was on the military committee and he was voting legislation to fund himself out in the Civil War. And finally, we have Oliver Morton, who was the governor of Indiana. So these are the men from the Civil War who were honored during the 19th century. There were no Confederates or Confederate-oriented people until the 20th century, partly because the Confederates states were very poor. They were devastated after the war, partly because the attitudes of people were changing over time and there was much more acceptance. So the very first 2 Confederate officials were, and the first one is an ironical, John Kenna. Now, not many people know John Kenna, and in fact, he was from West Virginia, which was, of course, created in the Civil War. It's separated from Virginia because it was pro-Union. But John Kenna, as a young man, was a Confederate soldier. And so that's not why he's on it. He became a very major political figure in West Virginia after the war. But the fact that he was in the Confederate Army makes him the very first Confederate. The second was Jabez Curry, and in 1909, and Jabez Curry was an important, mainly because he was an important figure in Alabama education. He served as a soldier. He didn't play a major role as a soldier in the Civil War, but afterwards, he was considered the father of education in Alabama, made sure that Alabama was widespread throughout the state, but separate but equal. There was a very different system for whites and a very different system for blacks. But Jabez Curry was the very first honor from Alabama. The first major Confederate figures who were honored were Robert E. Lee of Virginia. This is Robert E. Lee's statue in 1909. We'll talk more about him later. Some people find it interesting that Lee was the very first person honored by Virginia. The second person honored by Virginia was George Washington, but not until 25 years later, 1934. Lee came first, Washington came second. And this is Zebulon Vance. Zebulon Vance was the governor of North Carolina during the Civil War, Confederate governor. The next Confederate figures, or pro-Confederate figures, were Uriah Rose, 1917. Uriah Rose was not a soldier, but he was a judge, an active judge in the Confederate government. He was a major figure. He was one of the founders of the American Bar Association and a leading international figure in the law. And James Paul Clark from Arkansas, in 1921, again, minor figure during the war. He was an editor, statesman, educator, and considered one of the major figures of Arkansas during the 19th century. But again, a pro-Confederate, pro-secession, pro-Jim Crow, pro-black codes. Then in 1922 and 1925 were the next two, and these are two generals, Edmund Kirby Smith of Florida. Edmund Kirby Smith was a major figure in the Civil War, the commander of the Department of the West. He was the last Confederate commander to surrender. That was in late May, 7 weeks after Lee surrendered in Virginia. Edmund Kirby Smith surrendered in the West, and Joe Wheeler of Alabama, 1925. Wheeler was a graduate from West Point. It was either 1860 or 1861. So he was a very young man during the Civil War. But he was a very active cavalryman during the Civil War. So he was the second one honored by Alabama. 1926, Crawford Long was the first person honored by Georgia. Now, not many people know Crawford Long, but every single person watching this webinar and myself are thankful about Crawford Long, because Crawford Long is the father of anesthesia. He's the person who discovered the use of ether during operations, and everybody has to be thankful to him for that. Again, he was a soldier for a short time. He was a surgeon for the Confederate Army during the Civil War. Next, in 1927, Alexander Stephens, the vice president of the Confederacy, and he is still there today. And in 1929, South Carolina emplaced Wade Hampton. Wade Hampton was one of the richest men in the United States. He joined the Confederate Army. He created his own legion. He had like 4,000 men whom he had so much money. He created the weapons, the uniforms, and fed them throughout the Civil War. And he was a major cavalryman during the Civil War. The first person honored by South Carolina was John C. Calhoun back in the 19th century. I'm sorry, but later in the 20th century. But again, he died before the Civil War began. Then in 1931, Mississippi gave these two statues. The first is Jefferson Davis, President of the Confederacy. And when I put this statue up, people look at that and say, that's Jefferson Davis. I don't think it looks anything like him, but again, that's his statue. And we have James George. James George was a minor figure during the Civil War, but also a major figure in education after the war, and did a great deal to foster public education in Mississippi. Again, segregated, but still a major figure. So these are the two men from Mississippi. I did want to mention one of the other aspects of the Statuary Hall is that there were two copperheads. Now, copperheads are a snake, but they're also a term that was used during the Civil War for Northerners who supported secession, Northerners who were sympathetic to the Confederacy. And there were two of them who were honored in Statuary Hall. One was from Ohio, William Allen, and he was in place in 1887. Not many people know who he is. And Julius Morton of Nebraska. Julius Morton was an agriculturalist. He was Secretary of Agriculture in the 1880s, and he is the father of Arbor Day. So I think that's why he was honored. These are two men who were anti-Union, pro-secession, pro-Confederacy. The last two men honored with ties to the Confederacy were Charles Aycock in 1932. Now, Charles Aycock was born in 1859, so obviously he didn't fight in the Confederacy. But he was one of the legislative leaders of implementing Jim Crow, the Black Codes, supporter of the Ku Klux Klan, and white supremacy in North Carolina while he was governor. And Edward White was the very last Confederate to be honored. He was a very young soldier during the Civil War, but eventually he became a Supreme Court Justice and Chief Justice of the United States. And I wanted to illustrate White's life as an example of how the Confederacy and its role in Statuary Hall, and it's through these two decisions. And these two decisions, Plessy versus Ferguson, 1896, Brown versus Board of Education, 1954, Edward White was involved in a certain way. Edward White was born in 1848. So he joined the Confederate Army, no, 1846. He joined the Confederate Army when he was 16. He was born in Louisiana on a sugar plantation owned by his father, who had been the governor. And of course, it was a slave-run plantation. White joined the Confederate Army. He was a guerrilla fighter for part of the war. He, excuse me, was captured, a POW, and was paroled after the war after being in prison. After the war, he went to Georgetown University in Washington, finished his law degree, became a lawyer, began a political career. He joined the Ku Klux Klan. He was a congressman, governor, and then he became a United States senator. In 1894, he was appointed to the Supreme Court, an associate justice. So he was one of in the majority, 7-1 in Plessy versus Ferguson. That's this case over here, which constitutionalized separate but equal racial discrimination that was constitutional in the United States in 1896. He was Chief Justice from 1910 to 1921. He died in 1921. 1954, the Supreme Court unanimously rejected Plessy versus Ferguson in the case of Brown versus Board of Education under the leadership of Earl Warren. Now, that was 1954. I'll remind you that White was placed in 1955. His emplacement was part of the massive resistance in the South to desegregation. And I found it interesting and ironic that at the opening, at the unveiling of White's statue, one of the speakers was Earl Warren. And Earl Warren said in his remarks, quote, Edward White was a proud warrior for the Confederacy. And Warren didn't think this was a problem. And he said that White had instilled a firm constitutional order. Well, part of that constitutional order was Plessy versus Ferguson. So I find a certain irony. But anyway, it's bringing the two together. Earl Warren, Plessy versus Ferguson, Brown versus Board of Education. Okay. Now, I'll just mention some of the Union men who were honored during this period. Jacob Collamer, a senator from Vermont. John Ingalls, a newspaper editor and leader in Kansas, 1905. James Harlan of Iowa. Francis Pierpont of West Virginia. Francis Pierpont is the father of West Virginia. Samuel Kirkwood of Iowa was governor of Iowa during the Civil War. Zach Chandler of Michigan, senator. Thomas King of California was governor of California during the Civil War. And Hannibal Hamlin of Maine. Hannibal Hamlin was the first vice president under Lincoln. And sadly, he was not renewed, but that's another story. These are other Union military men who were honored during this period, and we don't recognize some of these people now. William Beadle of South Dakota, I don't know many people remember him, but he had a minor role. He was a soldier, rose to the rank of general. Lew Wallace, who was a very important general, made a lot of enemy because he was very outspoken. He's most famous for being the author of the book Ben-Hur. Then we have George Shoup of Idaho. Again, not many people remember him. And the ever famous George Washington Glick of Kansas in 1914. Again, people don't remember these people, but all of these men were Union soldiers. I also wanted to mention that in the 21st century, 3 Indians have been honored. And this is Chief Washakie. Again, none of them did any fighting in the war, but all of them did what they could to protect the interests of Indians during the Civil War. Washakie in Wyoming, Sarah Winnemucca, who was like Sacagawea, one of the 2 Indian women, and Chief Standing Bear of Nebraska. Now, Chief Standing Bear replaced William Jennings Bryan in 2019. And a couple of other people I should mention, they don't really fit. They fit in the Civil War era, but they don't fit for certain reasons. Now, Sam Houston was honored by Texas in 1905. Now, Sam Houston was in a very strange situation. He was the governor of Texas when Texas seceded, but he opposed secession. He said they should not secede, and so he was essentially kicked out of office, and he went into private life. He died in 1863. He eventually accepted the Confederacy, but he played no role in the Confederacy. So I'm not quite sure if he should be considered a Confederate or not, but there you are. And then in 2013, this wonderful statue of Frederick Douglass was placed in the Capitol. But of course, the District of Columbia cannot be in Statuary Hall because it's only for the states. But I thought this was a very good picture. And obviously, Frederick Douglass was one of the major figures during the Civil War. Okay, so it then brings us to the 21st century and the sesquicentennial of the Civil War, and really the last 25 years, but the last 5 years have brought a very much of a new focus to the question that I stated in my book: who should be memorialized in the United States Capitol? This is a recent picture, and the question has been answered to a certain extent by the fact that in the year 2000, federal law was amended, and that whereas the states could put in 2 people, now the states were allowed to replace people. This was not allowed until the year 2000. And since 2000, 16 of the 100 statues have been replaced, and several of those from the Civil War era. So this is part and parcel of why the fact that Statuary Hall is central to this debate. As I say, Statuary Hall is in the Capitol, AL, and the Capitol, OL, the Capitol building and the capital of the country. And so the very first Civil War figure to be replaced was, oddly enough, a Union officer, George Washington Glick over here. He was replaced in 2003 by General President Dwight David Eisenhower. And Kansas decided to have Eisenhower depicted as a general, not as a president. In 2009, Alabama became the very first Confederate state to replace their honoree. They replaced Jabez Curry with Helen Keller. And those of you who know the history of Helen Keller, this is a picture of Helen Keller. I think she was 9 years old And those of you who have been to Tuscumbia, Alabama, this is of her at the water fountain outside her house, where she said her first word. The word was water. She felt the water coming out of the pump. And the sculptor illustrated her life. Obviously, she had a very, very, very difficult life because she could not speak, could not hear, could not see, but she became a major figure. But the symbolic moment of her at her water fountain in her backyard was very important. In 2018, William Allen, the Copperhead, was replaced by Ohio with Thomas Edison. I think that was a good choice. In 2023, the other Copperhead, Julius Morton, was replaced by Willa Cather. Willa Cather, one of the most famous American woman writers. Now, the 2020s obviously have greater momentum to remove Confederate statues. From 2021 to 2023, there were several proposals that all Confederate statues should be removed, and that legislation was not passed. On the other hand, there were the movements all around the country, especially after the George Floyd incident, the George Floyd murder. All around the country, there were movements to replace and remove Confederate statues. And one of the most famous was down nearby in Richmond, Monument Avenue, where statues of Robert E. Lee, Stonewall Jackson, Jefferson Davis, Matthew Maury, and Jeb Stuart have all been removed. And these are some of the pictures from that time. I mean, here's the Lee statue when it looked at first. Here's the Lee statue when it was being spray painted, and here's the Lee statue being removed. And here's some of the others. So that was a very momentous moment in the 2020s. Closer to Washington and Arlington Cemetery, which was originally created as a monument to Union dead, you'll remember that there was a Confederate monument memorialized in 1914. There were Confederate dead allowed to be buried in Arlington Cemetery. And this is the monument created by Moses Ezekiel, who was a Confederate soldier. He was a sculptor. And this is the picture of that statue being removed in 2023. My wife and I visited Arlington Cemetery a few weeks ago, and there was a lot of talk about this, a lot of controversy over this. So that was going on outside of Statuary Hall. Separately, by legislation, several Army forts have been renamed because they were named originally after Confederates. So Fort Benning, Fort Bragg, Fort Gordon, Fort A.P. Hill, Fort Hood, Fort Lee, Fort Pickett, Fort Polk, and Fort Rucker have all been renamed. And now let's get back to Statuary Hall and the changes in the 2020s. The most dramatic event took place at 3 a.m. on December 21st, 2020, when Robert E. Lee was removed, his statue, and it's going to be eventually replaced by one of Barbara Johns. This is the statue. Barbara Johns was a high school student in the 1950s who was one of those leader against segregation and leading to the Brown versus Board of Education. And this is a picture of the Lee statue being removed. Now I have a short video here, and it kind of summarizes what happened. I hope you can all read. There's no sound, but I think you can all read. I'll just let this run. It's about a minute and a half. Okay. The next was in 2022, Florida removed the statue of Edmund Kirby Smith with the statue of Mary Bethune. Mary Bethune was a distinguished Black education leader. Now I have a video here, but I'm told by my colleagues that it's not coming through. So this is I'll just show you some of the pictures. Here's pictures of her of the evening news when she was alive. And here's a picture of the unveiling of her statue. She's smiling. She got her academic regalia on, and she's got a black rose in her hand. It's a white marble statue, but there's a black rose, which is a symbol of freedom. And it says she's replacing the statue of Edmund Kirby Smith. The people talking about it. Again, I'm running through this quickly. This is the woman, the sculptor of the statue. Again, I'm sorry for the sound, but this is some good pictures of Mary Bethune. She founded the National Council of African American Women. One of the most important leaders in the civil rights movement of the 60s. Right. And then in 2024, North Carolina replaced the statue of Charles Aycock, again, who was a leader in the Jim Crow and Black codes and white supremacy movement in North Carolina. He was replaced by a statue of Billy Graham, one of the major religious figures of the 20th and 21st century. And in 2024, also, Arkansas decided to replace both of their statues, James Paul Clark and Uriah Rose. And I have a video here again, which describes the process, but again, I don't think it's going to work, but it talks about the fact that the governor of Arkansas, a Republican, Asa Hutchinson, said they replaced it, one of them with Johnny Cash, the other with and these people talking about it. There's Cash. And okay, so here's the picture. So James Paul Clark was replaced by Daisy Bates. Daisy Bates was, it's wonderful that they have these descriptions on the bottom here, civil rights leader, and she was a journalist and a very important figure in Arkansas. And interesting, the style, it's a contrast in a very colorful style. You notice Mary Bethune was white marble. This one is in deep color. And then in deep color also here, the statue of Johnny Cash. So also during the 2012, I want to mention that 4 Union political, so it's not just Confederates had been replaced, 4 Union political figures had been replaced. In 2009, California replaced Governor Thomas King with a statue of Ronald Reagan. In 2011, Michigan replaced Senator Zach Chandler with Gerald Ford. In 2014, Iowa replaced James Harlan with Norman Borlaug, whom I mentioned about the father of the Green Revolution. And 2022, Kansas replaced John Ingalls with Amelia Earhart. So Kansas replaced 2 Union people with 2 modern people, Amelia Earhart and Dwight David Eisenhower. So those are the changes so far. I know there's been discussion in Mississippi about replacing Jefferson Davis. There's been discussion in some of the other states, but right now, as of today, these men, these are the 9 remaining Confederates in Statuary Hall. Jefferson Davis, Alexander Stephens, the president and vice president of the Confederacy, General Joe Wheeler, Edward Douglas White, Edward George, Zebulon Vance, Wade Hampton, John Kenna, and Crawford Long. So that ends my presentation. I'll go back to if I can get back here to the beginning. That's a brief look at the Civil War and its how changes in Statuary Hall are related to changes in the United States over time. Now, I want to mention that I'm working with a young professor in North Carolina, a fellow named Sam Flowers, to revise this book. Again, I self-published this book. It's not an in-depth history. It's more of a kind of a summary of everybody in Statuary Hall related to the Civil War. We're hoping to do a scholarly book, again, tracing the history of the Civil War and its effect on American history and how that's reflected in Statuary Hall over time. And obviously, I think one point we make was the 21st century has been a mirror image of the 19th and 20th century. The trends of the 19th and 20th century are being reversed in the 21st century, but we have 75 years to go. So who knows what's going to happen. So thank you very much for giving me the opportunity to talk about this. And I hope there are some good questions, and I look forward to answering them.
Absolutely. Well, Gene, thank you so much for uh, sharing this history, sharing this information, talking us through how this all came about. We're already getting some questions, and I'll remind folks, please feel free if you have questions from today's conversation to go ahead and add them to that Q&A section so I can see them and synthesize them. One of the first questions right off the bat was raised by several of our listeners after that amendment to the authorizing legislation passed in 2000, which allowed for the rotation of statues. Can you talk us through a little bit about what happens to those statues that get replaced and rotated?
Well, again, each state, again, the state has to decide. The state notifies Congress, and there's also a procedure that the architect of the Capitol has to agree to how it's going to be placed, how much it can weigh, how big it is, because they don't. And also the House and the Senate have to agree to their placement. And now again, the House and the Senate have never disagreed, but the legislation also says they really need to know where the old statue is going to go. And for the most part, they've gone back to the state capitol, or they've gone to a university, or they've gone to a museum somewhere in the state. But they don't just go into a landfill. They go to someplace back in the state, usually in a place of honor. The statue of Robert E. Lee, as I understand it, is in a warehouse, and I don't know where. So that's still up for discussion. But all the others have gone to museums or to the state capitol or somewhere in a place of honor.
Absolutely, absolutely. And as I understand it, one of the last hurdles for Florida's rotation of their statue of Kirby Smith for the new statue of Dr. Bethune was finding a place of honor to display the Kirby Smith statue.
Yeah.
That they didn't exactly want it at the State House in Tallahassee. But thank you for that, Gene. Other questions coming in. Do you know if there is any chatter? I don't know if you've heard if there's any interest in some of in particular in Mississippi and Georgia, who have those leading figures of the Confederacy. If there's any discussion about rotating those statues.
Well, as I say, I've seen some news articles that in the last 2 years, one or two state legislators in Mississippi have proposed changes, and the legislation has gone nowhere. No one's pushing very hard, and no one's really focusing on the issue, as I understand it. My colleague Sam Flowers, hope Sam's watching with me. As I say, I'm getting on in years, and Sam's just beginning his career as a professor. So we're going to be co-authors of the book. I want to help Sam in his career. Sam tells me that there's some discussion beginning in Georgia. For instance, we have Jimmy Carter uh, being one of the new people honored. Uh, but as far as I know, there's nothing much going on. I would think Martin Luther King might be another candidate from Georgia, but there is nothing. There are no serious attempts in the sense that there is no major campaign that I'm aware of in either state to do anything. I could be wrong, and I'd love to hear from people. If they know, please let us know, because we'll be able to put that in our book.
Absolutely. No, we always, eager to hear from our friends and, history lovers across the country. If you hear of such movements, it certainly affects the
Sure,
capital history
please.
we get to practition. And I do know, from my understanding, to your point, Gene, that these rotations take pretty significant effort in the states
Right.
because it's those state legislatures that have to vote on which of their two statues is no longer worthy of commemoration, or I shouldn't say worthy, but no longer their desired representative in the Capitol building, which of their historic figures is now worthy of commemoration, which can be controversial. But perhaps, as I understand it, the biggest controversy of all is how much the state government is going to pay for the new statue. Because the Congress provides a space in the building, but not exactly any sort of budget to work with for these states.
Right.
So if you hear of movements, or if you're looking to start a movement in your home state as you're watching along, we certainly want to hear from you. Um,
Please let me know, because again, we're at the beginning writing. We need to know.
Absolutely, absolutely. One like sort of technical, sort of numeric question, and then I'll throw you a sort of bigger picture, sort of open-ended philosophical question here in a second. But the numeric question, I know we ran through the various rotations. Gene, do you have a ballpark of about how many statues have been replaced since the rotation was allowed in 2000?
16.
There we go. Thank you.
16,
Excellent.
and I understand there's Washington State is about to do one. That may be numbers. I don't know if that's been done or not. So that would be 17. I've forgotten the name of it was an Indian leader from Washington State, but I don't know whether that's been done or not.
Gotcha. We'll
Do
have
you
to.
know?
I don't know off the top of my head, so
But
we'll have
so
to
as
dig
far
into that.
as of a few weeks ago, it was 16.
Gotcha. Excellent. Thank you. That gets to that question for one of our listeners here. Appreciate it. And then once we'll sort of close out as we come to the end of our time here with sort of a uh, more open-ended, somewhat philosophical question. As we ran through those 16 rotations that as you talked us through a number of those, it seems like there might be a bit of a trend away from, shall we say, explicitly political figures. That we're getting more, we get Johnny Cash, we get Billy Graham, we get Thomas Edison, figures who are not exactly in the mold of presidents and generals. There are certainly some notable in those 16, but do you think this speaks to an overall, from your study of this area, do you think that speaks to an overall shift in how we think about commemorating historic figures, perhaps?
It certainly could be. Obviously, it's to say this is one of the oddities of this whole thing, that because it's 50 different state legislators deciding this, I, I don't know how you can have any consistency, because each one of them's acting autonomously. And I would note that among the recent changes were President Reagan, President Eisenhower, uh, President Ford. So that's politicizing things, and Harry Truman.
Sure.
So, but I don't think there will be anyone ever again from the Civil War. Um, Unfortunately, maybe there should be, but I think that maybe that's again, time changes. Um, Johnny Cash was certainly an interesting choice, and
Hmm.
Billy Graham. But yes, I would think a few. But again, it's only 100, and it's 50 autonomous groups
Right.
deciding. So if you can find any consistency, let me know.
It's worthy of certainly mulling over. Well, Gene, I want to just say thank you again for your work in this space, for your ongoing scholarship, for sharing of that with us today and our audience here live and the folks who are going to watch this recording on our YouTube channel in perpetuity. This is what Jane likes to call our NPR moment, where I thank everyone for their ongoing support of the U.S. Capitol Historical Society. Though we are chartered by the Congress, we are not funded by the Congress. So we rely on our generous members and donors and supporters to help us keep doing this public history work, to keep us sharing these important stories and helping us think through who we are, how we got here, and better understand where we might need to go as a nation, a great experiment in democracy. So we've got some upcoming events that I will just encourage everyone to go check out on our website, capitolhistory.org. There's a little slider that shows you all the upcoming events. Thank you for your continuing engagement in our work. Gene, thank you once again for sharing of your time and of your scholarship. And I hope you all have a great rest of your week and keep working towards informed patriotism, as our charter language suggests. Be well.